I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, the place to learn from thought leaders in the world of wine and marketing, welcoming you to a specially commissioned episode featuring Gordon Russell, winemaker at Esk Valley. A hugely talented and respected winemaker, Gordon shares stories of the people and terroir he knows so well that his wines so eloquently translate. Recorded shortly before the UK release of the 2018 Heipipi The Terraces, Esk Valley's iconic flagship wine, we hear Gordon's origin story and initial entry into the world of wine. He talks mentoring in his first position, talks history of New Zealand wine, takes us on a regional tour of geography and geology, takes a deep dive into Hawke's Bay's culture, his transition to becoming Mr. Esk Valley. We take a deep dive into the terroir from which the Terraces wine is made, taste the Terraces 2016, talk vintage differences, Sulphur additions and closures, before looking ahead for his next project beyond the Terraces. Enjoy.
I'm actually one of those lucky ones that turned a hobby into a life, ultimately. I got interested in wine, I suppose, long before the New Zealand wine industry is as you know it now. And I mean, back in the day, and I'm talking the mid-1980s, the New Zealand wine industry was really in its infancy. The first vines had been planted in Marlborough. There were Cloudy Bay had made its appearance, and the London Wine Trade Fair, and caused a sensation as such. And interest was just emerging. It was all just beginning. I lived in Auckland at the time. My only sort of, I suppose, knowledge of wine and cellars and so forth was having worked in an English pub, quite honestly, where I was lucky enough to be responsible for a cellar. I brought in the beers. The dray people would roll the barrels down into the cellar, and I would put them into racks and put spigots in them and look after the cellar and look after the beers. And it was something I loved. I mean, prior to that, I was I was initially, my university career was destined towards becoming a town planner, but I became pretty discouraged with that. So kind of the punk scene in London was sort of a big lure. I wanted to see the world. I'd always been the adventurous type. So left New Zealand, said goodbye to everyone, said I wasn't returning, found myself through a succession of jobs and so forth, but ultimately found myself in a cellar and found myself enjoying the beverage industry. Got back to New Zealand, and like I said, the wine industry was just beginning. And on a whim, I hopped on my motorbike one day and rode to every winery which I could reach on a daily commute. And at the time in Auckland, funnily enough, I mean, New Zealand wine industry, a large part of it was centred around Auckland. So there were the last remnants of the Dalmatian wine scene, lots of ports and sherries and, old style wines were being made. And luckily, I found a cellar that was looking for a cellar hand, and harvest was approaching. So I was kind of thrown in the deep end. Loved the experience. I mean, it was amazing. And I was very lucky to have, as a winemaker, a young star of New Zealand wine industry who took me under his wing. And, I mean, I made life easy for him because I worked hard in the cellar and had a kind of fetish for cleanliness and organisation, and everything was very organised. In return, he taught me wine. He taught me how things operated in the cellar. He taught me chemical analysis of wine. We tasted a lot of wine. And then my thirst and interest in wine spread to, that sort of state where you buy every bit of wine literature you can. I mean, this is back in the day when Jancis Robinson's Vines, Grapes and Wines was the book of the day. Buying as much wine as I possibly could. which not only was kind of old world classics as such, which were affordable in the day, but also the first renditions of Chardonnays and Sauvignon Blancs and what was happening in New Zealand. So that was my first sort of toe in the water that ultimately became my lifeblood, ultimately. And one thing led to another. I found myself at Villa Maria. And Kim Milne was the winemaker there, and Kim, who's gone on to sort of, a lot of accolades around the world as an original flying winemaker in some respect. I found myself ultimately down at Esk Valley as assistant winemaker. And then in 1993, when my colleague Grant Edmonds was transferred to Auckland to be the winemaker of the Villa Maria group, I ultimately found a job as winemaker at Esk Valley. And that was, how it all began in terms of my current position.
Yeah. No, really, really interesting. And I think, it's great to touch on, as you were saying, those Dalmatian producers. And, I was always, super interested to learn about, how much really things have changed in a relatively small amount of time in New Zealand. And, what I may just ask you to, expand upon a little bit is actually just that first mentor that you mentioned, because I'm just kind of curious, because it feels as though that maybe just in and of itself maybe kind of captures a really interesting moment in time, because it sounds as though you were sort of arrived when a lot of things were kind of in flux. And I'm just curious, kind of almost like what did that kind of look like in terms of mentoring for you and kind of opening the door for you when you were I guess not sort of set on going down that path. What was it about that relationship that kind of got you going really and got you on your way? I
mean, it's hard to answer, but that's a really hard question to answer in terms of what but I think it's an infectious job. Making wine, it's that sort of mix of agriculture, business, dirt, and going home tired and covered in sort of, the work of the day. You've red hands and red teeth when you're blending, and it's physical, it's mental, it's all encompassing, and you're taking something in its infancy. And what it becomes later on, in some respects, you've got no idea of. No, I changed that. You have an idea of what it's going to become, but you haven't got the fine tuning of it. You've kind of got taking grapes, tasting them, tasting juice, and then ultimately trying to capture the soul of what you've got and turn it into a fine alcoholic beverage. I love the mystery of it. So there's kind of, I love my job in terms of everything it encompasses. And it encompasses, like I'm trying to say, agriculture, romance, business, history, cellars full of music, people I like, the food aspect of it, which is always born into the world of wine as well. Culture, I love all of that. And when I sort of wandered into the cellar, first of all, I probably didn't realize what it was going to, and what it was going to entail in some respect. I mean, it was, and I've just forever been surprised at what the job and the industry actually offers someone with both the willingness, the energy, the imagination to dive right into it and participate in it. And, like I said, I mean, the winemaker who I first met wasn't much older than I. His name was Stefan Jelicic. So he was from sort of the Dalmatian community as such. He'd gone to Roseworthy. He'd trained. There weren't that many in New Zealand who were trained winemakers. And he brought, I suppose, a new perspective to wine. I mean, prior to that, the industry was a Dalmatian-focused industry, and it always surprises me that making fortified styles of wine, I mean, the Dalmatian wines and the old world styles which they were trying to make were warm country wines, and they were making them in a sort of damp, cool climate, which in reality, if they'd modified their aspirations and made sort of lighter style wines, it probably would have been a more honest attempt at wine in some respect. But, you know, it was wine to grapes, semi-ripe grapes, to which sugar and alcohol were added. And there was no real, quality perspective to this when compared to the wines of the old country as such. But those were just styles of wine which they were accustomed to and actually liked. But, you know, we used to, in that sort of first vintage of mine, a lot of the grapes arrived on trucks from Gisborne and Hawke's Bay and so forth, and were transported around the country to the wineries, which mostly happened to be perhaps in the Auckland region at the time. So it was, you know, the industry and how it's changed. And, you know, when I think about that, that was 40 years ago, 35 years ago. So the change is dynamic. It's phenomenal what's happened in such a short space of time.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think this is also one of the things that really gets me excited in talking to winemakers in New Zealand and, you know, doing air quotes, you know, in the new world, is just that closeness really. And like so much of the history and the change and development has happened within your lifetime and even within your working lifetime, you know, within your adult lifetime. And I always just find that so amazing. And, you know, and I hope it's something that, today and, you know, through lots of other channels as well, you know, it will kind of be captured, because I think it's sometimes, a little bit easy, to kind of oversimplify the story of New Zealand and, you know, simplify it down into one grape and one style. But there's so much nuance, and I think so much of it has happened so recently that, you know, you can almost explore that history, and, you know, as you were rightly saying there, that element of exploring the history, I think, is a great avenue that's going to hook a lot of people that you know want to explore history and want to kind of see living history.
The history of New Zealand wine is being made with each vintage, and it is. You know, if you look at the graph of perhaps what we know and what we're doing and the accumulation of knowledge and so forth, and, you know, the results of our experiments, and it is happening on a curve that is so dramatic in terms of its upward projection. I mean, I'm sitting here as we speak, and the glass of wine that I'm, you know, sort of sipping on when I get the chance is a Grenache. So as far as I know, it's New Zealand's only Grenache. I mean, who would have thought? But as the world warms, as you know, many places which are, you know, the traditional homes of certain grapes, and nowhere better perhaps than this one, and perhaps, you know, we'll look at, say, Châteauneuf-du-Pape or somewhere similar. As the climate's warmed, their wines are getting, you know, 15% was, you know, probably back 10 years ago, 15 years ago was an exception. Now it's the rule, and things are often approaching 16% and so forth. So places which are cooler but have sufficient heat to ripen them are making those elegant styles, which perhaps was once the forte of somewhere else. I've also, in the same artisanal collection, bottled Tempranillo as well. So, you know, New Zealand is a constantly evolving wine scene, which I think, as is Australia, South Africa, California, you know, and I suppose it's a good time to mention too, in some respect, I often, you know, that terminology, old world and new world, you know, I don't get upset about things. I mean, I'm a bit more calm and, you know, for that, and a bit more cruisy in some respect. But, you know, using the term new world to, in some respect, just, I don't know, as a quip and a put down perhaps of Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. When in reality, Australia has, arguably the oldest vines in the world. New Zealand has now been making wine, especially from Sauvignon Blanc, for say 40 years. And it always amazed me that the old world are constantly changing as well. And what you're tasting in Bordeaux and what you're tasting in the Loire and elsewhere are relatively new styles of wine, which put us in exactly the same footing as the old world and the new world. It's just every wine region cannot sit still. We need to keep learning and experimenting. And as our vines get older, we learn to tend them better. We learn the best times to pick our grapes. We learn to manage each season differently. And it's a constant evolution. And so I really dislike the old world and the new world. I just think of us all somehow in the world of wine and trying the hardest we can.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And it's it's a term that I'm using less and less. And I think it almost, when you really examine it in the way that you just have, it kind of loses its meaning, because it's, I think, around the world, we're trying to make the best wine that we possibly can. And, I've just, been at the London Wine Fair, and, there's all sorts of regions around the world that are just making, knockout wine. So, and I just think, that point you made around, with the, via the sort of Dalmatian winemakers, it's okay. Great to kind of transport that history and that sense of experimentation, but also I think what you speak to as well is just, having an awareness of what Mother Nature is giving you, where your feet are now, what could be modified. And, there's loads of levers that can be sort of pulled. And I'm sure we'll get into that when we maybe start talking more about winemaking.
One thing I would say to all of that, though, is that this is a young landscape. So this is perhaps the new world in terms of geography and somewhere to make wine. The ancient continents of the world, whether that be Europe or Australia, are such different landscapes than what's out my door and what's in Marlborough and so forth. This is a landscape which is forever evolving. It's youthful, it's volcanic, it's got a fault line that runs right down the middle of it. The soils in which we grow grapes are young soils. That we found the free draining in the warmer sites in the country, which generally tend to be on the east coast of the two islands. But these are young soils in which agricultural products or agricultural crops and so forth have only recently been planted in, quite honestly. And, it's such a contrast to when I say the old world, I mean, we'll talk Europe and Australia, California for that matter as well. The landscapes are much more weathered, and they've been utilised for agriculture for centuries in some cases. And I often think you can see that in the New Zealand wines, the essence of the forest that was there literally 150 years ago, I think speaks perhaps through the wines. There's the true, or the youthful purity and energy of the landscape is still available for plants and crops to uptake. And it's pretty dramatic, I think, the effect that has on the personality of our wines. So I think we make pretty unique wines in New Zealand as a result of the landscape in which they've been grown.
Yeah, amazing, super interesting, and I think these are all the sorts of things that will appeal to a different kind of consumer, or it tells a different kind of story, and very, very poetic way to kind of put that in terms of that energy really that's kind of available, but it has a sort of an identifiable base though, right? If you look into, as you say, where were the forests, and what is actually the kind of the geological age and the geological activity that's happening there, which are, again, the things that can be kind of quantified and maybe even a little bit sort of, yes, mixing the art and the science really there.
Yeah. I've got a vineyard which is very near to where I live. We actually, the wine that it produces as such, we call seabed Chardonnay. But in some respect, it exemplifies New Zealand, well, I was going to say New Zealand viticulture to a degree. In 1931, Hawke's Bay, where I live, suffered a massive earthquake in February, early February 1931. Anyone who's been to Hawke's Bay, part of the tourism, or in the tourism brochures will be the Art Deco buildings and the Art Deco culture of Hawke's Bay. That was as a result of the earthquake. When it was destroyed in 1931, it was rebuilt, 1932, 33 and so forth. The style of the time was Art Deco. So it was all built with that Art Deco architecture, which has aged really well and has become a draw card for many tourists to Hawke's Bay. But as a result of that earthquake, the province was geologically altered significantly. So in Hawke's Bay, sort of north of Napier to where I live in Bayview, there was a big inner harbour that ultimately got lifted a few metres, drained, and has largely sort of sat there underutilised. The airport was put on some of the land, and a lot of it's quite swampy. But at the northern reaches of that, where once there was perhaps bulrushes and where the Esk River itself used to meet the inner harbour, there's a series of obviously tidal flats. And once, I suppose, must have been bulrushes and, half the day it was underwater, salt water, and the rest of the day it was drained in a mud flat. It's on that land, now that it's been drained, that we have a vineyard planted. So it's growing in saline. On the map, it actually says saline marine deposits. The vines are dry farmed. They have their feet, I think, permanently into sort of a higher water table. If you dig into the soils, it's marine sort of clays with seashell in it. The wine that comes from it is the most sort of saline, smoky, rich, complex Chardonnay wine, which we make. And I love the way that the landscape itself has transposed itself into that wine as the result of a dramatic sort of geological incident that was literally 90 years ago. So I mean, I think there'll be lots of stories like that of New Zealand wine and New Zealand vineyards that, the sites in which many of these vineyards grow literally didn't exist 100 years ago. So it's very interesting, very complex, very new, very dramatic.
I think it just goes to show that you kind of never know, I guess, what Mother Nature will bring you, and even, within a relatively short space of time, as you say, things can be altered and things can be kind of, mixed up literally right below your feet. One thing I'd like to, just sort of guide you back to really is your story at Esk Valley, because you really, you spoke about, I guess, kind of taking us to the door and to the moment of when you became the head winemaker. And I wonder, just to give us context and to give me context, you wouldn't mind just sort of taking us through a little bit those kind of earlier years, and what did you inherit, and what had you been seeing as the assistant there, and maybe taking us through what were some of the changes and opportunities that evolved during those first years.
Well, in some respect, I think I was thrown in the deep end, but I was ready. I think the hardest part in all of this, and I think that many people who listen to this will perhaps understand this, that you're working with people and then suddenly the next day you're their boss. And that's a really difficult transformation. So the hardest part almost in the transformation from being assistant winemaker and running the cellar in some respect to then being, you can't be you can be friends with your work colleagues, but in reality, there's a time you have to step up and be their manager and get the best out of them and so forth. I don't think I was trained and prepared for that. That took time, and I had to learn that. But in terms of the winemaking, what I inherited and what I walked into 3 years prior was a very old historic winery. So the Esk Valley winery had been established in the 1930s. And it was what turned out to be lucky, and the signature part of the wines and the story we told later was 23 open-top concrete fermenters. So these are 5-ton concrete pits, literally, that were dug into the earth in which we made our red wines. It's really old-fashioned, meant we had to plunge and manipulate the cap as such by hand. The winery was perched on the south side, which down in the southern hemisphere is on the cold side of the hill.
Yeah.
We had gravity at our disposal, which we learned to use over time. And we found efficiencies and a very natural way to make wine in what was a very old plant. And so I think our wines, as a result of the winery, in some respects spoke of that craft. And in a wine industry which was fast becoming engineering focused in some respect, and there was a lot of technology entering into the industry back in the 1990s. In some respect, we perhaps were certainly the most traditional part of the Villa Maria group in terms of the aspirations, the styles of wine we made, and so forth. And it's just, that was kind of the route that I took with the brand and with the wines that we made. Now, Sir George Fistanich, who owned Villa Maria, had bought Esk Valley back in 1986 and had sat idle for a few years. But when he, gave me the job as winemaker, he said to me, and sort of remember it vividly, Gordon, I want you to become Mr. Esk Valley. And it was kind of I didn't quite, I think, initially understood what he meant. But with time, I kind of became inseparable. Gordon Russell and Esk Valley. We kind of became the same thing. And so I was responsible for the wines, but I also became responsible for the stories, and I became responsible for the brand and the image of the winery and the stories are told and so forth. And it's been an amazing opportunity, dare I say, and it was kind of encouraged. And, anyone who's visited the winery, I mean, in some respect, we've made friends, Esk Valley and Gordon Russell and my family and so forth have made friends with perhaps a lot of the people who will be listening to this who will have visited the winery, visited our house and so forth. So with that opportunity at Esk Valley came also my interest in wine, which then spread to perhaps new varietals, new vineyards, new ways of doing things. And my love of the world of wine and tasting from, afar basically found its way into the Esk Valley wine styles, into the blends we made. And Sir George was, an incredible mentor and from a distance encouraged us to plant New Zealand's first Verdelho, make New Zealand's first Malbec, make arguably, makes the very first dry Merlots that were made in New Zealand. Co-ferment fruit from our terraces vineyard back in the early 2000s. I mean, who in their right mind would co-ferment Malbec, Merlot and Cabernet Franc from a single day harvest from our, I suppose, most prestigious vineyard and make our most prestigious wine. So there were lots of opportunities, and we grabbed them, we experimented with them, and Esk Valley, I think, just became a hotbed of interesting wines, and ultimately a great place to work and so forth. So I feel I've been very privileged. And the other thing I've got to add to all of this is that if you drive up the drive of the Esk Valley site, turn around, you're looking out over the Pacific Ocean. You've got an amazing limestone hillside with grapes planted on it, on this sort of facing the sun. At the top of that is the site of what used to be one of the great Maori pass sites of New Zealand, where for 400 years Maori lived on the hillside, and they knew what a great place it was to live and and so forth. I mean, when they arrived, they could have lived anywhere in New Zealand and literally chose that hillside for the advantage that it offered. And I often felt like that when I worked in this little valley, in this winery. I could see what they saw in the place as well, and I felt privileged to work there because it was just the most beautiful, site. It was incredible.
Yeah, very cool, and really getting into the living culture and the foundations of what Esk Valley is, and kind of, I guess, what it means, which I'm sure, with your continuity and your tenure, I'm sure, still kind of permeates within the, kind of the way that things are done over there as well, which again, super interesting. What I want to do is just actually, I think encourage you to change gears slightly, because, I know we'll have lots of people listening who, are New Zealand fans, and as you rightly say, there have probably been to the vineyard or maybe are working with the wines, or certainly working with New Zealand wines. I want to just encourage you to almost give us a drone's eye view, really, of kind of what Esk Valley is now in terms of where the growing sites, and kind of maybe situate yourself and where you're speaking from today in terms of how long does it kind of take to reach these different sites, but also what's the experience like of kind of standing in those different sites, because I get the impression that you're still very hands-on, and we'll value getting out there and being in those different sites and checking in on them at different times of the year.
Going to work now, I drive half an hour from where I live in Bayview. In 2018, Sir George Fistenich built a new winery out on the Gimlet Gravels. His plan was to bring the winemaking closer to the grapes, and most of our grapes are, sort of more into the hinterland of Hawke's Bay, centred around the Gimlet Gravels wine growing district, and created a new winery for both Esk Valley, Villa Maria, Te Awa, and Vidal. So there were 4 brands, and we sort of share the winemaking premises. Now, that was a big move, having made wine for, nigh on 30 years at the site in Bayview. What I lost was the view, the 1.5 minute commute to work, which suddenly became a half-hour commute each day. So that was a slight change of lifestyle, dare I say. But I wasn't going to lose my concrete fermenters. And I convinced Sir George that those fermenters were an integral part of the Esk Valley winemaking style. The wines we made, the personality of the brand, the stories we told. So he agreed, and we ended up, I jumped into one of our fermenters up at work, measured it, sent the internal measurements to them at Villa Maria in Auckland, and we ordered 13 concrete tanks from France, which were delivered in time for the 2018 vintage. So I feel very privileged in some respect in this winery to bring some of that craft from my old winery and carry on the sort of style and the winemaking personality that I think is integral to the brand. So The Gimlet Gravels, where it's planted. I mean, that is a key sub-region as such for not only Hawke's Bay, but, certainly for the Esk Valley brand. And outside the Terraces site at the old winery in Bayview, all the rest of our red wines come from Gimlet Gravels sub-region. Now, the Gimlet Gravels sub-region is 800 hectares of stony gravel soil. Mm. And the river nearby, the Nararoro, which is the largest of the Hawke's Bay rivers, back in the 1860s during a massive flood, it's now contained by stop banks and so forth to avoid this happening again. But literally, it must have been, massive flood. It changed course. And before it did, it scoured all the topsoil and everything off this particular piece of land and left an inland desert, literally in the heart of Hawke's Bay, which sat idle for, for 100 years, basically 120 odd years. And it was viewed very poorly in Hawke's Bay. I mean, if you go back 50 years, 70 years, even probably shorter period, Hawke's Bay is a farming community, and any land that doesn't grow grass isn't really of much help. Yeah. So, in lieu of growing grass, it was allowed to, I suppose, rabbits to roam. The army put sort of rifle range and munitions sort of an area to practice blowing things up. There was
the land was pretty cheap, I understand as well.
The land was very cheap. I mean, even when it was an awareness that it could actually grow good wine. At the beginning, it was still cheap. And so people got in early. And I mean, Sir George Fistenich, once again, recognised the value of it and managed to procure a pretty sizable part of the Gimlet Gravels. But myself and the other winemakers of Hawke's Bay, and into that, I mean, I'm sure I'm going to forget some, but, there was Steve Smith, Alan Limmer, John Hancock, Kate Radburn, there was Paul Mooney. There was those of us who had made wine or who were making wine from these soils, who would always perhaps say, we'd talk about the fruit that we grow out on the gravels or out on the stones and so forth. And we always in our cellars found that the parcels of grapes that grew in this, in what is now the Gimlet Gravels, were making our best red wines. So we wanted to give it a name. So we got together, collectively came up with the name, the Gimlet Gravels, and literally set out to sell it to the world. We were lucky, it was good planning actually, but the very first Pinot Noir conference in New Zealand, we literally hijacked Jancis and, a lot of the media that had come to that, put them on a bus, brought them to Hawke's Bay and sold them the Gimlet Gravels, named after the Gimlet family that originally owned it, Gimlet Road in the middle of it. I think if you ask any of them today, I mean, they've been back, they've tasted the wines and they know the story. So it was really good to be able to give that, parcel of land a name. But there's more to Hawke's Bay than the Gimlet Gravels. I've got my Chardonnay vineyard out here in Bayview that I spoke about before. I mean, it's literally where I live at the coast here. It takes me half an hour to drive to the Gimlet Gravels. So it's probably, 30 kilometres away, I suppose, inland. The sea breezes, which cool things out here in Bayview and allow a sort of frost-free environment here. By the time we get to the Gimlet Gravels, there's frosty winter days. The sea breezes are just sort of dying out by the time they get to the Gimlet Gravels. It's warmer. It's, certainly a place where we can ripen red grapes with ease, probably, most seasons anyway. But then there's other sub-regions which are really important to the Esk Valley brand. And if we follow the river that created the gravels and travel upstream for maybe another 15 minutes drive, we come to a place called Marae Kakaho. So up there, which is probably only about 10 kilometres in the straight line, 15 kilometres upriver, we've got the heat that we get in the Gimlet Gravels, but we've got such cool nights that we manage to retain the acidity that you tend to lose in the Gimlet Gravels. So up there we're growing Chenin Blanc, we're growing Gamay, we're growing Albarino. So there's pockets of land around Hawke's Bay which are all generally free-draining river terraces. And that's one thing actually I'd like to sort of point out perhaps in the New Zealand viticultural viewpoint. And perhaps we'll just use Burgundy as an example. You know, the best land is found on the hillsides where you've got the drainage, where you've got the aspect to the sun. And down on the valley floor, you're going to find the heavy soils which are less suited to premium grape growing. In New Zealand, we're lucky enough that on the plains, in certain places on the river terraces, we find the free-draining soils. On the hillsides, we've got much more perhaps limestone or heavier soils in some respect. The complications of viticulture that go with it. So we've kind of lucked in some respect that we're getting the effects of the hillsides on the plains or on the certain river terraces where we get the same advantage, but it's much easier to manage and operate those vineyards. So it's kind of a reversal, but it works very much in our favour. So wherever there's river terraces in Hawke's Bay with free draining soils, you'll find pockets of vineyards, and each of those sort of little sub-regions has perhaps their own speciality and what they can bring to the Hawke's Bay wine scene. Sure. We're lucky enough that we have the opportunity to make wine from many of them, and I feel that's a real advantage. The gravel soils in which we grow generally make bright wines which have just got a fragrance and a youthfulness and a kind of, fresh fruit sort of notes to them. Very, lots of snap in the wines, lots of, fresh personality, very vibrant. The Gimlet Gravels is a very complicated place to grow grapes, though, because the reality is that the water table is so far below the surface that very few of those vines have yet found it. And the wines generally need to be supplemented with irrigation to allow them to live and produce wine, quite honestly. But that's, once again, there's often, perhaps in, especially in French agriculture, dare I say, that, it's always perceived that the use of irrigation is to perhaps pump up crops and to manipulate viticulture in some respect. What we're doing is, in reality, growing small vines and tough soils, but managing to keep them alive. And we're often without that irrigation, we wouldn't be able to, produce anything at all. So, often in New Zealand, things have just been flipped around slightly, and we're learning as we go. So one other region and one other vineyard which I think I have to sort of spend some time talking about is a vineyard which we initially called the Terraces, but ultimately with time we've labelled it Heipipi The Terraces. Now let me explain. So we've gone up the river. We've spoken about Marae Kakaho and its, cool climate, nature. Very cool climate, nature. The Gimlet Gravels for its warmth and heat. The Chardonnay vineyard out here in Bayview, growing in the marine site. Literally just north again of that, near to the coast, and literally within 500 metres of the coast, we have the Terraces vineyard. So this is a vineyard that taught me how to make wine. No other vineyard has so much been a part of my everyday life because I looked at it every day. I could walk in it every day. And it was the one which was closest to my heart. And it was the one which I pushed the boundaries further and further with than any other vineyard I've had the opportunity to do so. So, I mean, what I inherited here was a vineyard. And actually, it's got a nice story because the story for my involvement in this vineyard goes right back to when I was working at Villa Maria. My very first sort of year that I was working at Villa Maria back in, sort of 1988 it would have been. Mm-hmm. And I found that there was a vineyard being established in Hawke's Bay at the Esk Valley winery site. And I volunteered to come down and help establish the vineyard because I wanted to learn about that sort of aspect of what, viticulture and also winemaking. So I came down and I spent 2 weeks of my holiday time effectively ramming posts into a very steep hillside which had previously had a pine forest on it and was being transformed into a, I suppose, European-inspired vineyard. Very rare in New Zealand and very exciting to be a part of it. The first thing in my memory of it was how warm it was in winter. And it faces sort of northwest, which meant that it basically got every ray of sunshine every day. So it was this remarkable sheltered amphitheatre in which we were ramming these posts. And then, as it turned out, 5 years later, I was actually making the decisions on making the wine from this vineyard. So we, and uniquely, had planted in it Malbec, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But after a while, there was a realization, perhaps, that Cabernet Sauvignon wasn't going to ripen in this vineyard. Now, the reason it wasn't going to ripen in this vineyard was because it had actually been planted in the coolest part of the vineyard. Mm-hmm. So right at the top where the sea breeze clipped the vineyard was where the Cabernet Sauvignon was planted. So it was unfortunate that it wasn't planted elsewhere. But we removed that, planted some more Merlot at the time, and every year set about making a single vineyard wine, which we sold to our mail order customers, mm-hmm. and created what was an aspirational New Zealand wine. And in many respects, it was, predated Napa and the cult wines of California. And we were making this wine in anywhere between, say, 250 and 350 dozen bottles. Mm-hmm. So it was small production, mm-hmm. one bottle of wine per vine. And we only released it in years where we thought it met our aspirations. So it became really exclusive. It was expensive to make, and it had a cult-like following. So we learned how to grow the grapes better and better. And then finally in 2001, it kind of struck me that instead of making 3 small ferments, wasn't I better to pick it all on a single day, stick it into one of our concrete fermenters, and make a wine that was absolutely true to its place? It became about the vineyard rather than about me. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't me sitting there and deeming what was the best wine that came from the vineyard. It was up to our viticulture, the site itself, and that particular season to determine the personality of the wine that ended up in the bottle. I mean, I was inspired by Marcel Dice and sort of, a lot of his Alsace single vineyard wines. I mean, truth be told, that was my role model for it. As far as I know, no one in the world was mad enough to be co-fermenting Malbec, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc. But to me, it just seemed a natural sort of extension of both the site and my understanding of fine wine. So the only thing to do after that then became dry farming it in 2007, taking all synthetic sprays and weed sprays and so forth out of it. So it became, as the vines got older and older, we were keeping both the soil and the vines in better health, and we were making a wine that was truer and truer to that hillside, that site, and so forth. Then came realization we were calling it the terraces. Now there's terraces wine in Napa, there's terraces wines all around the world. So that's where the Heipipi came into it. And Heipipi was the name of the Maori pa, which had, sat at the top of the hill literally for 400 years. So to us, it just seemed a good idea to give it that unique personality of the place. So hence it then became Heipipi The Terraces. So that wine that is, that we've made now for 30 years plus, I think says everything about my understanding of fine wine. So it's all about a place. It's like taking the winemaking, turning the winemaking into being a custodian, rather than sort of putting my own personality on it. Sure, it's aged in oak barrels, but I don't want the wine to taste oaky. The wine's obviously fermented with wild yeast. Our aim is to bottle it without finings and filtration. When you taste it, I want it to be that taste of the place. And I mean, I'm just one of those many winemakers in the world who feel and understand that, but that is my true expression of it. Now, the story has a sad ending in some respect, and that's that as sort of the wine situation with Esk Valley, Villa Maria, and so forth is unfolded, we don't now have access to the grapes from that hillside. So 2021 was my last vintage using those grapes. And I've got to say, I mean, I shed a tear. It was kind of so much of my life had been bound up in that wine. But thankfully, nature gave me the opportunity to arguably make the best wine that we've ever made from it. So it's yet to be released. It's still in barrel, and literally 18, 19, 20, 21 were just, an incredible run to end that part of the story.
I'm really loving this because this is, in my dream setup with interpreting wine. I just love that idea of, starting broad and then really narrowing down. And I love the sense that you've given us in terms of being in that vineyard, its Maori history, and really its place in the wine world. And one, I guess, geeky aspect that maybe you don't get to talk about. And it sounds as though it's actually potentially quite exciting for you. And now with the benefit of hindsight, I'm curious for you to explore, like, what was it really that changed when you went ahead and started doing those co-ferments? Because I hear a lot spoken about this, and I hear about it spoken in the this is what it's sort of ideally meant to give you. But yeah, just give us a sense of, what did you find when, I guess, the risk was taken with your icon wine to start co-fermenting it?
So the concept of co-fermentation is, to me, that it becomes so much better than the sum of the parts. So I was fermenting Cabernet Franc in a small fermenter, Merlot in a small fermenter, Malbec in a small fermenter, and then looking at, blending them to make what I thought was the best wine. But when you co-ferment things, somehow the integration of textures and other nuances and things into the scene which I could never quite manage when I was blending them together. And I mean, call me romantic or something, but it's also, funnily enough, I mean, a lot of modern viticulture and a lot of the world is dividing vineyards into micro plots, fermenting them all separately, and then, blending them to make the best expression imaginable. One of the things about the terraces, because it's a limestone hillside, so that makes it unique as well in our portfolio. Everything else growing on gravel. So here we are in this limestone hillside, actually interspersed with layers of shell through it as well, which makes it really interesting and really unique. But there's bits where the slopes run sort of counterintuitively in some respect to the rest of the row. So they will suddenly drop off and then there'd be slight hollows in the rows. I mean, nothing is uniform in there. And we would find there's bits with a bit more vigor than other parts and so forth. Now, if I was to micromanage it, which I could have done, and in some vintages I did, but generally there are bits of that vineyard that don't make wine perhaps quite as good as further down the road.
Yeah.
But my idea with that vineyard was to capture all of that. And so I wasn't trying to make a lesser wine. I was trying to make a wine that totally expressed all the nuance of that site. So maybe those bits that were slightly less ripe, they brought more acidity to it. They brought some nice brambly herbal notes, whereas 50 metres up the row where the vines had struggled a bit more and so forth, we were getting into the more riper, not quite raisin, but the more darker fruit notes of the wine. So it's kind of like people's personality or people's looks in some respect. You know, everyone's got some bit they don't actually like, but that makes them unique and a part of who they are. And so we set out with the goal to use every vine in that vineyard to play a part in the finished wine. So there were places where we cropped things, you know, a lot lower. I mean, trying to actually ripen Malbec, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc to be picked on a single day isn't straightforward. So we had to develop techniques of when you prune vines, the earlier you prune a vine, the earlier it comes into leaf the following season. Now, we haven't issues with frost here. This is a frost-free site. But Cabernet Franc, in the scheme of things, would ripen the last of those three varieties in that vineyard. So that was the vine or the variety which we would prune first. So that would bring it into leaf first. And then it was the one we'd do the most leaf plucking on. So we're always encouraging the Cabernet Franc onwards, whereas the Malbec was generally the earliest to ripen, and we'd always just be trying to slightly retard its ripening by having less leaf plucking, by pruning it later, almost as it was just coming into leaf, so that we would ultimately, at the end of the season, find a time where we could harvest it all on a single day. So there are a lot of learnings involved in this site, which then just made it all the more special to make wine from. And that was ultimately just the whole concept, was to capture every vine, to capture that magnificence and uniqueness of place in the glass, ultimately.
Fantastic. And, you know, I'm very fortunate that I'm sitting here with a glass of the 2016. And as we're kind of recording this quite early in the day for me, I did open this last night and, was able to enjoy this with dinner. And I've got to say, it really surprised me. You know, I think that, you know, so many times when either at fairs or, you know, at home or tasting with friends, when I've tried those icon wines, you know, they feel as though they're trying to kind of pack a punch, if you like, and, you know, really, you know, make that memorable kind of indelible impression. And I was blown away really by elegance is the word that kind of comes to mind. And, but also, you know, now that hearing you kind of talking about how this came together, also harmony as well. You know, I just think these three grapes really sing from the same hymn sheet, if you like.
I mean, harmony's a really good word. I like that. I think there's Burgundy-inspired winemaking utilising Bordeaux varietals, if you can call Malbec a Bordeaux varietal, which, you know, is debatable. But, each brings its own characteristic to that wine. So Malbec brings colour and the brambly sort of dark blackberry fruit. Cabernet Franc very much perfume, front palate entry or whatever, so it fills the front of the palate. And Merlot, I suppose that generosity in the palate. So it's all of them work in unison, but it's hard to detect where one starts and the other finishes as such.
No, I couldn't agree more, and I'm glad that you said it first, because I wasn't sure if that would be kind of a controversial thing to bring up, but that was the other thing that surprised me, because I was looking for the individual characteristics. I knew which grapes were in there, and I'll admit it was challenging. I didn't pick up. I mean, it would be a great wine to blind taste people on, because I think they'd struggle to know where it was from, and which grapes were in there, and kind of what proportions. And I think that that's a compliment to the winemaking and a compliment to the site, because it's something that feels as though it is definitely of the place, and it is that, I guess, that kind of higher level of trying to really capture what it's like to be there and what it's like to pick fruit and what are the growing conditions like in one very specific site.
I mean, it's perhaps well understood now, perhaps, co-fermentation, and you go to any, region of the world, whether that's, it can be anywhere, perhaps, whether it's Spain or Sicily or Australia, Adelaide Hills or anywhere where young winemakers get together and push the boundaries of what's been done before in their regions. And co-fermentation of, the most unlikely varietals has become very much the culture of wine, which I like and buy into and so forth. But bear in mind, back in 2001, which was 20 plus years ago, there was no sort of, it just wasn't done. I mean, in some respect, this was,
someone has to be first, don't they?
So scary and so pioneering at the same time.
Yeah.
But it just made sense to me, as it makes sense to everyone now. And I just think, in some respect, that wine, without most people actually realizing it, is one of the pioneering wines of its type in the world.
Amazing. I love it. And I think, one thing, as we focus in on this wine, and I know that around the time that this podcast will be released, we'll be actually landing in England through Hatch Mansfield, will be the 2018 vintage. So I'd also like to, you've gone really closely into the winemaking, into the site. I'd like to, maybe talk about a bit of the vintage variation, looking at the 16 and the 18.
Yeah, I mean, you notice there's a skip with 17, so there was no 17. So 17 was an incredibly challenging vintage, and there was, funnily enough, it was a very wet and very challenging vintage. But what we've found is that particular vineyard has this incredible capacity, due to perhaps its dry farm, the health of the vines, the old vines, the low yields. But it seems to have the ability to withstand the elements even in the most challenging years. Now, it was never an option to bottle the wine as the Terraces or Heipipi The Terraces, given its pedigree, the price we asked for it, and so forth. But it still made wicked wine. So we had created a second label for the vineyard called the Hillside. And the Hillside was just our Kiwi vernacular for the Terraces vineyard. So, we actually at the winery would never call it the Terraces. We'd always say the Hillside. So that became our second label for it. So if you actually see 2017, the Hillside, it's perhaps a less dramatic take on the vineyard, but it's still got all the personality of the place, and I think it's cracking wine. But that leaves us with 16, 18, 19, 20, 21, and so forth. The vineyard has a capacity, even in the cooler harvests, to ripen grapes fully and express perhaps just a slightly more leafy personality, autumnal sort of notes, perhaps, rather than the really dark fruit notes. But it's funny, the wine 2016 that you've got in your glass there, I like that wine. I like the texture of it. I like the nuance. There's kind of a bit more wet earth or something in there. Whereas perhaps 2018, 2019, so forth, have got more jammy notes. And when I say jammy, I'm not meaning 16% alcohol, desiccated grapes in any way. Just
it's all relative,
really
right?
Dark, pure blackberry and dark fruit, sort of blackcurrant jam notes to it. But every vintage has its own stamp, its own personality, but at its core is that place. And I think place supersedes vintage.
One burning question I have, really, which comes out of my visit to the London Wine Fair and hearing from winemaker at Villa Maria, Dave Roper, and also a conversation I had with an MW student, was actually around two things: sulphur and closure. So I noticed that, the bottle that I've got here, the Heipipi Terraces 16, is under screw cap. And I guess the sulphur part of that was really around, what is the, I guess the evolved wisdom or the best current thinking around what are the types of sulphur additions that you need for this to be able to express itself when it kind of goes out there into the world.
Well, generally, okay, so a wine like the Terraces or Heipipi The Terraces, we will only be picking clean fruit. So if there's any damaged berries, we will leave them in the vineyard. When we handpick the fruit, we will then, so the fruit will be in good condition in the fermenter. I'll let wild yeast ferment it. It'll then be pressed, go through malolactic fermentation, and when it's through malolactic fermentation, I will then add sulphur to it, and I will generally add maybe 50 ppm at that point, post-malo. Depending on any reduction and so forth is how long I will leave it on its full lees and barrel before I will look to racking it. Each racking, and we might do 3 rackings, the sulphurs will be looked at, and if it falls probably below 20 ppm, I will then add some. Ultimately, the wine will be bottled at 30 ppm, free sulphur, and we have found that the totals at that time generally tend to be measured at somewhere between 60 and 80 ppm. We keep the barrels in cool cellar and basically top the barrels regularly. Anytime we open the bung, we will add dry ice to keep oxygen away from it and so forth. So we're very vigilant. It seems that we have put so much energy into that growing season and to get the wine finished and put to barrel, that we're going to be very vigilant and very, attention to detail has to be fanatical in some respect to preserve the quality of the wine. One thing I would say, though, I mean, every wine and every vintage is slightly different. So you have to have your eyes open. Yeah. I make wine in the most natural, hands-off way I possibly can. But that does not mean that when things need intervention, I don't know what to do and when to do it. And some vintages require a more heavy hand. And if you don't, you're being naive and you're literally not doing your customers or anybody else a service. So my job is to make the best wine I can, I find the best way I can make wine is to do as little as possible, but I'm only allowed to do that when nature dictates. So you've got to be smart at the same time. When it comes to closures, I mean, I don't know whether I can actually tell a short story. I mean, this goes, my experience with it goes right back literally to the beginning. And it was the first vintage that Esk Valley ever bottled under screw cap was 2001. And every wine that we've bottled since has been with that as a closure. Now, that began with Sir George Fistonich dragging the winemakers into his office in Auckland one day and saying, what do we think about screw caps? And we were saying, well, we'd like to see how wines under screw cap develop. We should be trialing it and seeing what's going to happen. He also asked us what we thought about putting our finest wines under screw cap rather than just the cheap ones. If it's good enough for the cheaper wines, surely it's good enough for the best wines. And the reason that he was concerned about it is that ultimately George was a wine lover and a wine businessman second. And he just was always mortified that we could make great wine and it would be ruined by the one thing that we never had control over, and that was the closure. So after our meeting in his office, I think probably about a week later, he informed us all that none of our wines would ever be under cork again. He'd decided to go 100% screw cap. So we had no option, bought into it, and then for probably the next 2 or 3 years, I would come to the UK and I would have to talk about the closure rather than what was in the bottle. And it drove me crazy. It was just like I hated it. But I found very quickly that every bottle I opened was like every other bottle, that the wines survived the journey well. There was no, obviously, cork taint. We didn't change the way we made our wines. Everyone was saying, oh, you have to use sulphur, there's going to be reduction. We didn't change the way we made our wines. And what I've found over time is that not only do the wines age longer and purer. I mean, I recently opened some Esk Valley 20-year-old Pinot Gris, and they're fantastic wines. They'd never be fantastic wine if they were under a cork, right? So the wines definitely age slower. There's no doubt about that. And I mean, you know, the first Terraces bottlings we did, which was 2002, magnificent wine to this day, but maybe it's a bit young. Maybe it hasn't evolved as much as it ultimately should have. So I'm almost at the stage now whether, and I would, if I could only choose one closure, it would be screw cap. I make no mistake about that. I'd never bottle a white wine under a cork ever again. But for some of our reds, I wonder if being promised, and the cork industry has moved on sufficiently for me to trust the finest corks, whether I would be tempted to bottle perhaps our finest red wines under super premium cork to get a quicker evolvement in some respect in the wines. And I'm just throwing that out there. I'd like I said, if I could only use one closure, would certainly be screw caps. They haven't let us down, but maybe there is a place for cork after all. So I've got to carry on this story, though, slightly, because one aspect to all of this is that I alluded to before that we now don't get the fruit from the Terraces vineyard. You know, we had a contract after Villa Maria was sold to Indivin, which is kind of the recent development for Esk Valley. And, you know, the sale of Villa Maria, I now won't be making wine from that vineyard. So I alluded to that before, so that can all be incorporated in. But where do I take what I learned and what I loved about making wine in that style? How can I recreate that? How can I have so much fun? How can I push the boundaries? And how can I apply everything that I've learned elsewhere? And the only place that I've got to do that is the Gimlet Gravels. It's where the rest of our old vine collection is as such. So I've selected in a vineyard called Ngā which is one of the Villa Maria vineyards, 3 plots of grapes, which I have selected what I think are the best parts of those plots. So it was like 1,500 vines of Malbec and I think 1,000 vines of Merlot and 1,000 vines of Cabernet Sauvignon to be crop thin to yields which I thought were similar to the terraces, but also gave me the best opportunity to make wine of the best personality and wine of the best quality I could. I then set out to co-ferment them and make a version perhaps of what we'd made from the terraces vineyard in and from the Gimlet Gravels. And it's pushing the boundaries again. No one's tried this in the Gimlet Gravels, maybe for good reason. But vintage in the end beat me, unfortunately. It was just a bit wet at the end of harvest. But what I ended up harvesting shows so much promise that I can see this as being the new norm for Esk Valley, or certainly at a super premium end going forward. Same principles, different place.
Got you. And did you already tell us the name of the wine? And
well, we don't have a name. If anyone wants to come forward with some suggestions, I would welcome them. But
brilliant.
No, I haven't got to that. Haven't got to that yet.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I love that idea of you really we are focusing on Heipipi The Terraces, really getting into that site and your history, and there's so much kind of locked up into this wine, and it's kind of really the same thing that I've been talking about a lot at the London Wine Fair. Is just that I think when you really get into the story of these wines, there are just fabulous stories all around the world, and it takes time, really, I think, to really draw that out. So I'm so happy that I've had the time to speak with you about this in kind of such detail.
Well, I mean, another thing too, that sort of inquisitive wine lover in me has had the opportunity through a sort of new collection of wines, which we've labelled Artisanal collection. This is me literally having some fun and being allowed to experiment, push the boundaries, new varieties, new techniques, whatever. I mean, it's someone at my stage in my career, the opportunity, this is almost like something I wish I'd had years ago, but maybe I wouldn't have known what to do with it. And I've got to the stage now where this is perhaps something I've always dreamed of in some respect. 500 cases of Grenache, Tempranillo, Chenin Blanc, Albarino, Gamay, just Malbec-based red wine, just having fun. And I feel that, that's going to be an outlet too for my perhaps creativity, skills, just an opportunity to show what Esk Valley can do, what Hawke's Bay can do, and perhaps what New Zealand can do. So there's a lot going on, in the Esk Valley stable, which is perhaps really satisfying. Esk Valley has been, of the Villa Maria Group's brands, we've been very much the on-trade brand, especially in all our export markets. So that has given me the opportunity to visit the UK many times, travel to the US, travel the world as part of the job, which is, very fortunate and a great opportunity. But our wines tend to get sold in fine wine, and they get sold in the on-trade. Lots of restaurants, it's kind of our market internationally for our wines. And I think that's played a part in the style of wine which I look to make. So knowing that they're going to be served in restaurants, they've got to be either have really nice acidity and be fresh for restaurant glasses, or they have to have a textural complexity to them and so forth that will kind of perhaps, and nuance which will match with food and fine dining. That, I think, has been a big part of my winemaking experience as well. And I love food, and I think it's kind of reflected in our wines to a degree. And I think that's an important part of the Esk Valley story as well.
A massive thanks to you, Gordon, for being a fantastic guest. So interesting to go really deep with you on this wine and this particular piece of terroir and see all of the different facets of New Zealand wine and regional winemaking that it opens up. Do see below for the Esk Valley website where you can learn more about Gordon and his winemaking approach. I've also included below the links for the tech sheets for the 2016 and 2018 vintages that we mentioned, and also included details of Hatch Mansfield, who have the agency for Esk Valley in the UK. If you enjoyed today's episode, which I'm sure you did, I would love to get a review from you on iTunes, which really helps people to find the podcast and to decide whether or not it's for them before listening. And of course, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.